So we continue our study of the Great Enlightenment debate between rationalism and empiricism, which really began with rationalist René Descartes from France, and then the dialogue shifted to England with empiricist philosophers like John Locke. Then George Berkeley from Ireland challenged empiricism with empiricism, and then we met Mr. David Hume from Scotland, who came in like a wrecking ball. This rebel without a cause challenged that because we never actually experience cause and effect, we can never really claim certainty about things relating to causation. All we ever experience are recurrent experiences with continually conjoining things within that experience. That is, constant conjunctions. And so we can never speak of certainty, but only probability. Based on having continually experienced these conjoining variables together, we cannot say, as if we had that certainty, that we will experience them together next time. But we can say that it seems to be the case that we have reason to believe that we might. That is, we have no certainty, but we do have a level of probability that the next time we have an experience like this, we will also likely find within that experience these conjoining variables. Today we head to Germany, where we meet Immanuel Kant, the great mediator of the rationalist-empiricist debate. While we might find the pun in that last slide to be somewhat satisfying, the truth is Immanuel can and did accomplish many great things with the strength of his mind. This is not to say, of course, that his philosophy is exempt from critique. Indeed, in some ways it might be said that he raises as much controversy thereafter as had Descartes before him. Kant mediates the great debate between rationalism and empiricism within the Enlightenment. However, his ideas lead to a different sort of division between the schools of philosophy within the Enlightenment and the Romantic tradition after him. And as we move on toward the 20th century, between the philosophical traditions known as analytic philosophy and continental philosophy. So Kant has significant influence, to say the least. It was quite some time before Immanuel Kant actually wrote anything, and the reason was because of Hume. He says that Hume had awakened him from his dogmatic slumber. He had many ideas. He had studied philosophy. He had learned how to think about different perspectives and what perspectives were out there. And then he read David Hume and realized that, as Hume challenged, he was indeed holding many of his beliefs dogmatically without necessarily being able to back them up appropriately. Now, if you've ever had an ethics class, then you've likely heard of Immanuel Kant, and you know that Kant believes that there are certain duties that we have to one another. For example, we ought never to treat another rational human being as a means to an end. They are valuable ends in themselves. But recall, however, that if Hume is correct, and we are just a bundle of perceptions, then, as Hume concluded, there is no ought to be, there are no moral duties binding on us, for we are merely the slave to our passions, and there is no oughtness or duty lying within reach of our perceptions. And so rather than just brushing off Hume's challenge and saying, well, I know what I believe, I don't really care what he says, he took Hume's challenge seriously. This is a serious challenge, and it warrants serious contemplation. And so, awakened from his dogmatic slumber by Hume, Kant pondered these issues for decades before writing his famous works, which were few. Nevertheless, they revolutionized philosophy. Kant's work is considered the Copernican revolution in epistemology. Now recall what Copernicus brought to the table. We were certain that the world functioned in a certain way, and we were trying to understand it according to that presumption about how it worked. And so what Copernicus said was, well, are you sure that it works that way? What if it's the opposite way? What if the heavens don't rotate while the earth is fixed? What if the heavens are fixed and the earth rotates? So too, whereas tradition had emphasized the belief that knowledge is achieved when the mind conforms to an object, Kant's radical theory suggests that objects conform to the structures that are already in the mind. And so Kant is considered the great mediator in this debate between rationalism and empiricism because his conclusions offer a footing to each. They both have certain aspects of their conclusions correct, while both sides also miss something. For Kant, sense experience matches reality because our minds impose a structure onto our experiences, which organizes our sense experience into meaningful order. So picture a bird flying. For a bird to fly, what must be the case? What is necessary? Well, before something can fly, be it bird or airplane, there must be a design, right? A fox can't fly, but a bird can. Why? Because there is something to the bird that allows it to do that. That is to say, the bird has to have the right kind of stuff. The bird has to have the proper equipment. It must be equipped and able to do this thing. But there is something else that's needed. It doesn't matter how well built the bird is if there is no wind upon which it can fly. So for Kant, the nature of the bird, the structure of the wings, if you will, that's kind of like the structures in our mind. There's something that's necessary for intelligibility. And yet there is no intelligibility without an experience of which to speak intelligibly. So Kant distinguishes between analytic and synthetic judgments. An analytic judgment is a judgment that is true solely in virtue of the way it is constructed. It is a necessarily true relation of ideas. Its denial is a contradiction. Also, it provides no new information beyond the definition. If I say a triangle is that which has three angles, thus triangles have three angles, it is a contradiction to say that this is true and that it is not true. It involves a relation of ideas that you can take to your experiences, but it provides no new information beyond the definition itself. Also, it doesn't really make sense to ask if it's true because it is true by definition. A synthetic judgment is a judgment that unites matters of fact relating to our experience in a way that does not make their denial a contradiction because it is not a universal statement. So if I say triangles have three angles, I'm describing all triangles. And so if you deny that, then no triangle anywhere has three angles. If I say ophthalmologists are doctors, I've given you a definition. If you deny that, then no ophthalmologists are doctors. However, if I say ophthalmologists are rich, well, that could be the case, or it might not be the case. If I say the door is brown, that could be the case if we're talking about this door, but it might not be the case if we're talking about that door. So these are two different sorts of statements, and our judgments about them are two different sorts of judgments. So if I say triangles have three angles, that's an analytic judgment. If I say this triangular guitar pick is red, now I have combined empirical facts about guitar picks and triangles and redness concerning my experience. Now, Kant believed that mathematical judgments are all synthetic judgments because we engage in our mathematical reasoning within our experience. For example, when I count to 5, I might use my fingers to count. And when we think mathematically, we're thinking about this number and these formulas and things like that. However, when we observe the nature of geometry and arithmetic more closely, It becomes apparent that we can only do this because we have inborn concepts of space and time. That is to say, we possess a priori conceptualizations of space and time, or concepts that apply to our experiences, yet which we possess prior to experience. And we take these concepts for granted. We assume them when seeking order and meaning within the world. And we presume such concepts when we speak about meaningful experiences. So we bring this a priori conceptual framework to our sense experience, and we are then able to interpret that sense experience meaningfully because we already possess a priori this conceptual framework. And here we get an interesting adjoining of terms. Recall that a priori knowledge is knowledge that I have before experience. A posteriori is knowledge about experience or knowledge attained from experience. An analytic judgment is one that does not require experience, whereas a synthetic judgment is one that relates to experience. So here, Kant is suggesting, in a Copernican revolutionary way, that there are certain concepts that exist prior to our experience, a priori, certain knowledge, if you will, but that knowledge is meaningless apart from experience. Thus, we bring to our experience a synthetic a priori knowledge. That is, we engage the experience in light of our a priori concepts in order to make meaning of the experience. Recall the analogy of the bird. You have to have wings to fly, but wings cannot fly without the wind. So too, Kant is saying we have to have concepts already in place in order to make meaning of our situation, yet there is no meaning apart from our situation or experience without the application of such concepts to that experience. I think computers serve as one of the best examples for what Kant is going for here. So a computer is a thing that has it has hardware, but it also has software, right? An operating system. And if that operating system is not in place, then you don't have a computer. It's not going to do anything. You've got to have that software in order for the computer to know what to do. And yet, the computer cannot do anything with the software until you turn it on. It's got to be running. That is, it has to be experiencing the running of its internal design. So long as the processor or software is not running, there is no data coming in. There is no processing of information. When the computer is on and the software is running, then the computer is able to engage the data. As it experiences my typing of this key, it is then able to understand and recognize J. As it experiences my moving of this thing that we call a mouse, it is able to recognize where that thing should track on the display. As it experiences my using the mouse to click on this icon, it is able to recognize. If the computer does not already possess a conceptual framework for processing this information, then none of these actions have any meaning. On the other hand, it does not matter how well engineered or designed a computer may be. If it is not on and running, there will be no information processed. You've got to have both. So Kant is saying the rationalists are correct. There's got to be something there already. Yet the empiricists are correct. There is no knowledge apart from experience. You guys are both right, in a sense. So let's stop bickering and get on with it. Kant's theory of space and time is called transcendentalism, and he argues that metaphysics is in the very business of studying these synthetic a priori judgments. So space and time serve as insight into the fact that we have a pre-established framework, but there are other preconceptual frameworkings at play as well. Kant refers to these pure concepts of human understanding as the categories. These are a priori principles of possible experience necessary for understanding our actual experience. That is, we approach our logical reasoning about the world with certain logical preconceptualizations, and these include quantity, quality, relation, and modality. He distinguishes between phenomena and noumena. Phenomena is his term for things relating to my actual experiences, and noumena is his term for things as they are in themselves, apart from how I might actually experience them. Experience, he says, can never teach us the nature of things in themselves. So what does this mean for science? Well, a priori, before the fact of our experience, we have no access to the natural world. There's nothing to interpret. A posteriori, locked within the experiences themselves, we have no access beyond our subjective encounter. Therefore, we will never be able to fully understand things in and of themselves as they exist apart from us, apart from our experiences. Thus, experience cannot teach us the true nature of things. We can only, at best, understand things according to the framework of our own mind, the categorical, logical principles of order which structure all of our experiences. The computer can engage data and meaning only insofar as its processing capabilities allow it to. And since our experiences must be united within our own consciousness in such a way as to hold as a rule for the experience of all like rational minds, our pure concepts, that is, our shared rational principles concerning possible experiences, function as universal laws of nature, for example, the law of cause and effect, thus allowing us to investigate nature scientifically. So, where Hume had come in like a wrecking ball and smashed our confidence, Kant picks up the pieces of our certainty, ponders them carefully, realizes that the only way we could know anything is if we knew some things all along, and then drops a bomb, and then drops the mic. While our primary emphasis is on Western philosophy, I do want us to catch glimpses of other philosophical perspectives from around the world as we move throughout this course. Now, India has a rich history of epistemological investigation, so this week I want to briefly consider some Indian theories of knowledge. Indian philosophy has wrestled with many of the same questions as Western epistemology. For example, Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, argued, like Hume, that ultimately there is no I, or self, or soul to be known. Adi Shankaracharya, on the other hand, a Hindu philosopher and theist, argued to the contrary, that there is Atman, or a soul or self. Now, whether this I, or self, is the same I of which Descartes spoke, an individuality, or whether Atman is ultimately Brahman, all individual existences and experiences are ultimately manifestations of an absolute, all-encompassing mind, as the German philosopher Hegel would later argue. This is a different question. But East and West both share the metaphysical tension between materialism and theism or idealism, and relatedly the epistemic tensions between idealism, empiricism, and realism. The metaphysical tensions are primarily between realism and idealism. Is everything mind independent or mind dependent? While Buddhists and Hindus may disagree, for example, on the question of theism versus atheism, they may agree that everything ultimately comes back to a mind dependency. There is also the epistemic question as to whether we receive knowledge through rational intuition or religious inspiration, or primarily through the senses. Now, Eastern thought is every bit as complex as Western thought, and that makes sense because all philosophies are pondered by human beings, and human beings have complex rational minds, right? So I want to be careful here in dipping our toes in the water, so to speak, not to oversimplify a complex tradition of thought. In the same way that Western philosophy has many schools of thought within it, and at any given point in history, for example, the Enlightenment, we may find, for example, at least 3 schools of thought in tension with one another: rationalism, empiricism, idealism. And we may also find religious ideas in tension with one another that fit within those theories of knowledge. And we may find non-religious systems of thought or secular thought that fit within those theories of knowledge. So too, Eastern thought will be complex. In the same way that it would be problematic for me to just have you read Descartes and say that is Enlightenment philosophy, or just have you read David Hume and say that is Enlightenment philosophy, so too, by briefly pondering Indian theories of knowledge to see how this epistemic struggle was shared East and West, I am not saying that this is all there is to Indian philosophy and epistemology, nor am I suggesting that we have fully considered the depths and complexities of these perspectives. My point, rather, is to show how the philosophical journey and the struggle with these core questions of philosophy is not just a Western thing. These are the questions of human beings, and human beings throughout history, across contexts, have been pondering these questions deeply throughout time. Though different regions or different areas of the world may have at times focused on different questions or explored certain aspects of these questions to differing depths and degrees, these are nevertheless the questions of humanity. So as it relates to our studies in the West, this week I want to look at just 2 schools of thought within the Indian philosophical tradition of epistemology. One that stressed an empiricist-based skepticism, and another which held that through our experience we are somehow connected with a greater awareness of truths lying beyond the experience. Not unlike the skeptics and Epicureans in ancient Greece, the ancient Indian school of thought known as the Chakravar challenged the claim that we can have knowledge through rational intuition or religious inspiration. The Chakravar, meaning those attached to the way of the world, believed that physical matter is the only reality, all that can be known. They were empiricists. We can only know what we perceive through our senses, and therefore we cannot infer knowledge beyond the physical stuff. We don't actually perceive the knowledge that we try to bring to our experiences. All we perceive is the immediate stuff before us. Thus, reason cannot establish anything. And so they rejected claims to knowledge concerning immortality or rebirth or God or enlightenment through spiritual experience, things like that. The only real facts of our experience is that there is a physical world, and that in the physical world, certain things lead to our pleasure, certain things lead to our pain. Our self or soul or the I cannot really amount to anything more than our body. So our good is really based upon pleasure. So, like the ancient Greek Epicureans, the ancient Charvakas were hedonists. Pleasure and pain are the only real sources for determining value and goodness in the world. They are our best sources of knowledge. And human pleasure is the only goal of life, or the good life, that we can infer from our experience. And so, as in the West with the Greek Epicureans, and then later in the Enlightenment, following from the empiricist tradition, we have in the East the first articulation of utilitarianism, a materialist-based ethics that held the only ethical system compatible with materialism is to always act so as to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. Now, critics of the Chakravar pointed out that the Chakravar position is self-defeating because it rests upon reasoning that is unperceived. To say that our goal is human pleasure is not the sort of thing that we perceive. We may perceive pleasure, but to say that pleasure is good, or that we ought to seek pleasure, oughtness and goodness are not perceived. These are simply used to describe the perceived experience. So for the Chakravar to bring in rationalization of goodness and oughtness, they are smuggling in non-empirical concepts. The Chakravar reply to their critic was that, well, no other goal for human life can be perceived, and this is the best explanation that fits what perceptions we do have of pain and pleasure. Therefore, the burden of proof lies with the critic to show that there is reason to believe there is some other goal for human life. Of course, this retort misses the point that there may be no goal, and if that's the case, there is no ought, and thus there is neither justice nor injustice. There is only convenient and inconvenient. Let's contrast this materialist perspective with a perspective of metaphysical realism, the belief that our ideas concerning the things within our experience is ultimately grounded within the existence of a thing or things beyond our experience. So knowledge does not merely reduce to our conceptual framework, rather it involves inferences to a reality beyond and not dependent upon our conceptual framework. Two prominent, long-standing schools of realist thought in Indian philosophy are the Vaishishika and the Nyaya. If you recall from last week's discussion, Western philosophy, in its earliest tradition in ancient Greece, was primarily interested in understanding the nature of the world, especially the fact that we intuit universal concepts relating to our experience, and yet all we ever really experience are a series of particular things. You may also recall that one school of thought within ancient Greece was called atomism, the idea that the physical world is ultimately composed of a bunch of particles. Well, similarly, although it's not exactly the same, the ancient school of thought known as the Vaishishika was also primarily interested in explaining the fundamental nature of the world and was likewise interested in particularity, similarly supposing that all of the physical world breaks down into smaller particles. As I understand it, in its origins, there was not much theologizing about God, but with time, some began to argue for the necessity of a first cause to bring into existence all of the particular stuff in the universe. Now, in contrast to the Chakravar, notice that the Vaishishika is also empirically concerned, and yet it is not materialist in presumption. So in a sense, the Vaishishika was more of a metaphysical school of thought with an empiricist methodology, digging at the questions of metaphysics and physics, whereas the Nyaya was more interested in logic and epistemology. Nyaya was more concerned with epistemic questions of how do we know what we know, and the logical questions of what are the best or proper methods of inquiry and debate. Now, one area where East and West have differed involves internalism versus externalism. In the words of Daniel Bonavac in his text, Introduction to World Philosophy, he writes, Western philosophy has been predominantly internalist. Knowledge has been defined as justified true belief. In classical India, the predominant approach is externalist. Knowledge is the result of a process external to ourselves that connects us with the known. Perception, for example, is a process that depends on a connection between objects and our sense organs. Other non-perceptual ways of knowing, such as inferences and testimony, do not depend on direct connection with the object or objects known. These processes involve indirect connections. Nevertheless, all knowledge-generating processes must be examined from an external or impersonal point of view. Now, according to the earliest text in the Nyaya tradition, that is, the Nyaya Sutra, knowledge amounts to true belief that is produced by a source of knowledge. Bonnevet goes on to explain that those who are internalists, such as Buddhists, should note right away that on this perspective of realism, such as Nyaya Realism, we do not know whether an awareness is a genuine perception or an illusion. He says, a central thesis of realism is that any false awareness must involve deviation from the workings of genuine knowledge-generating processes. Part of the realist project is to spell out the conditions for recognizing knowledge generators so that when we do have doubt or dispute, we then know how to resolve it. But doubt itself is an abnormal condition. From this perspective, we do not have to doubt, and we do not have to examine our beliefs in order to know something. Nevertheless, he says, some conditions do call for doubt and inquiry, yet knowledge does not require justification. It requires only right connection with the known. According to Nyaya Realism, knowledge primarily comes from perception, and perceptual awareness does arise from the senses, and inference begins with the information received from perception. However, inference does not reduce to perception, since it produces knowledge about things that we do not immediately perceive. Thus, the Nyaya Sutra distinguishes between three kinds of inference. There is inferring the effect from the cause. For example, we see dark, threatening clouds, and so we infer that it will rain. There is also inferring the cause from the effect. We see the wet ground, we see the swollen creek, we infer that it rained. And then there's also inferring a general rule from its instances. We see dark clouds and then rain. We see lightning and hear thunder. We infer that, in general, dark clouds cause rain and lightning causes thunder. There is also an acquisition of knowledge through analogy and testimony. In fact, the majority of what we know, we come to know from others telling us stuff. When they tell us something, it causes us to believe it. Learning by analogy requires a prior understanding of vocabulary. So when someone explains to me what a water buffalo is, they might explain that it looks like a cow, except, and go from there. They were appealing to a prior definition I already had. If you describe a unicorn to me, you may appeal to my understanding of what one horn means and what a horse is like. But the real question that we need to see how Nyaya Realism answers is the skeptic's challenge. How do we know whether our source of knowledge gives us the truth? Well, the Nyaya Realist might say that the question is confused because we actually begin knowing that we have knowledge, because that is exactly what we're examining. What do I know? So we must know something in order to examine whether what we know correctly. Because of this, the Nyaya would insist that there are ways that we can test our knowledge. Now, interestingly, Nyaya Realism seems to be both foundationalist and coherentist. In one sense, our knowledge rests upon certain foundational beliefs, yet in another sense, there are times that we must examine our foundational beliefs insofar as those beliefs cohere with other foundational beliefs. Consider, for example, when we use a scale to weigh gold. Whatever gold we weigh upon the scale to get the knowledge of that gold's weight, we are assuming a foundational belief that the scale is correct, that it is properly calibrated. In this case, the scale is a source of knowledge. This is called pramana, and we have a foundational belief about the scale's reliability. If, however, there is ever reason to doubt the scale's accuracy, well, here we can actually use a different gold nugget, a gold nugget whose weight has been determined by other scales, and we can use the nugget to calibrate the scale. At this point, the scale has become the object of knowledge, which is called prameya. So, generally speaking, our knowledge rests upon foundations. Whenever we encounter any particular cases of doubt, then we investigate coherence in order to validate the foundation. But when we are not investigating justifications or worried about doubt, then generally speaking, then as long as we've reason to believe that our perception and our other sources are appropriately working, then we can say that we have knowledge. Another Nyaya analogy used to counter the skeptic is to say that perception is like the light of a lamp. And I think Daniel Bonavec really says it well, so I will read his words here. Sources of knowledge are self-revealing. Light shows itself as it shows us the objects we see. So light is a knowledge generator when it lets us see other objects. It is an object of knowledge when we direct our attention to the light itself. Thus, light is the source of knowledge in one context and the object of knowledge in another. To be a source of knowledge, he concludes, is simply to play a certain role in an epistemic context.